Welcome to the Paru Zings, Appraisers on Purpose podcast. This podcast showcases inspiring appraisers and professionals from the industry who are leaders in their field. How did they get to where they are? What have they learned along the way? And what do they do now for their teams, their clients, and the industry? Your host is real estate investor, entrepreneur, and appraiser, Michael Hobbs.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Perusings, the Power of Values. Again, we are excited for a phenomenal peer and just all around interesting guy. Tim Hansen is definitely one of those individuals who you meet and say, wow, that's a great way to put things together. And as we've heard from so many others, there's no one way into, around, and through the industry. And having had some time and known Tim for a little while, have great appreciation for what he's done, what he's doing, and what might come next. So, of course, make sure to hit that like button, because the more this continues to get out in the hands of peers and those that are even considering the industry, the greater the impact and the greater the influence. So, Tim, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for the invite. Appreciate it very much.
Hey, man, you're welcome. Very much welcome. I've been looking forward to this. I know you've had a lot of travel going on, so thanks for making time for being with us today. And we always love to know, Tim, were you born this way, or how did you get into the profession?
Yeah, that's a great question, Michael. I kind of look at it both ways. I mean, I sort of was born into it. My mom was an appraiser, and I started at a pretty young age. I think probably junior high school was where I first started.
Oh, wow.
As we always used to say, pulling the dumb end of the tape and measuring houses and going out with her to look at properties. And so, all through high school, I worked off and on, and she was the county assessor in a small county in western Nebraska. And I did a lot of work for her, doing property listing. I was good at drafting, so I did a lot of property record cards when we still used to use a pencil and a architect scale to draw houses to scale. I spent a lot of time doing that. So, I started out. So I guess I was sort of born into it, or was a family business. It was nothing I ever sought to do or wanted to do, but it led to lots of great opportunities throughout my career. And that was kind of where it first started, was just kind of hanging around the assessor's office and helping out where I could.
That's phenomenal. So your mom is in an assessor role. So you're getting to see a different side of the profession right from the start than most. Yeah.
I kind of came at it in a backward way. I mean, that was what she did. So I helped out, and it paid a little bit, which was better than, flipping burgers. I was happy to do it and learned a lot, and had an aptitude for it. And, I fought it my whole, through college and everything I did. I was like, that was not what I was really wanting to do, but I just kept falling into jobs, because I knew how to do it and was good at it. And I went to college at the University of Wyoming, and the assessor's office there had a part-time opening for a field technician.
No way. You go away for school, and here you end up, obviously, I don't know about you, but most students I know in school, they need to eat. So you got to do some work. It's kind of that exchange. You do some work, you get some pay, you can go get, buy things that you are interested in or need. So here you are, you get exposed to this again while you're at school.
Yeah. In fact, well, like you said, you have to eat. And so my first job in college was at a Godfather's Pizza. And the best thing about Godfather's Pizza at the time was you got a free mini pizza for every shift you work. And so I always had something to eat. I wasn't going to starve, but I knew that wasn't where I wanted to be. And so I was applying for various jobs and went into the on-campus job placement, office. And there was a job in the assessor's office. And I thought, hey, I know how to do that. I can do that. And so I applied and went in and ended up getting the job and worked there all through school. And it was really cool because it was like, 5 blocks from the campus, and I could go to class and then walk back to the office and work, go back to class. And so they were very agreeable to my schedule and working with me, and did that for, I was on the extended college plan, but I did that for like 5 years, and learned a lot about mass appraisal, and got to work with some professors from the university that were using that particular assessor's office as kind of an experimental way of doing mass appraisal. And so we got tied in with them. That job presented some interesting challenges and probably framed some of my future perspective on the industry. One of the things I got tasked with right off the bat was helping clean up a mess by a vendor that had been hired by the state to do the mass appraisal work, and they were paid by the parcel. And so,
oh, really? Interesting.
businesses being businesses, and maybe unscrupulous businesses, they had listed some of the same properties up to 5 times and given them 5 parcel numbers and gotten paid 5 times for the same listing. And so part of my job was going through all the files that this company had left behind and trying to identify how many duplicates were in there, and then going out and verifying, the actual information, and maybe taking 5 parcels down to 1 parcel and making sure that the records were accurate. So that was a learning experience that not everybody's got the best interest of the county or the state or the municipality in mind when they do these sorts of things.
So as you had, I think you said about 5 years of real work in an assessor's office, what type of activities were you taking on and handling maybe early on, and how did that progress over the time you were there?
Yeah, well, one funny little story before I start, as a broke college kid, going into an interview, I did have a suit jacket and a pair of dress pants and a shirt, but I didn't have any shoes other than I was in the National Guard at the time, and I had my dress shoes for my military uniform. And of course, they were highly polished. And it turned out the guy that interviewed me was a Marine Corps veteran.
Oh,
and, he told me later on that the reason I got the job was because my shoes were highly polished.
Isn't it amazing the things that you just don't know until you know?
Yeah. That's, that was one thing I always laughed about that, because it's like, I just did what I needed to do to, present myself for the job, not thinking about if my shoes are highly polished or not. But that, sometimes those little things make all the difference in the world. Those little attention to detail can make a big difference.
Yeah. And given especially that the person that hired you was someone who spent some time and had to learn to also accomplish such a task, and therefore have appreciation for other people who can do it.
Yeah.
In a similar level of quality. Wow. That is something else, Tim.
But the, as far as duties that I had, they were pretty varied. I just kind of was a utility infielder, I guess. I did a lot of whatever needed to be done. And it was a very rural county, Albany County, Wyoming, which is where Laramie is the county seat, and the university's there. But it extends northward. Gosh, it was about a 2-hour drive from Laramie to the north end of the county. And one of the most interesting parts of it was one of the summers that I worked there, we were doing a complete inventory of all the property in the entire county. And so we started at the north end of the county, which is very, very rural. Laramie Peak, which is actually in a different county, but it's at the very top end of the county. And so we would drive every day, 2 hours on dirt roads to the north end of the county, and then work our way back. Ooh. And this was before we had Google Earth. This was before satellite imagery. And so what we were working from was USGS topographical maps, and every black square on the map that denoted an improvement, we were finding them. We would drive around until we found them. This was before GPS. This was before all those kind of things. So we were out in the middle of nowhere, 2 hours, binoculars.
Oh, it was like you and binoculars, I assume? I mean, you're not using a telescope or anything. Yeah.
Yeah. No telescopes, but binoculars for sure. And I think that summer we went through 5 tires on we had a Chevy Blazer, and, we were constantly getting flat tires and, having to go back to town because we didn't have a spare anymore, those sorts of things. So,
wow.
And changing tires on a 30-degree slope in the middle of a sagebrush pasture is always an exciting adventure. But yeah, so we did that. Took us two summers to get the whole county done. There's just the 2 of us in one vehicle doing that work. Did all of the, of course, new construction and remodels and all of the things that assessors typically pick up. And then did a lot of drafting of, property record cards again, and data entry. This is, again, it's going to date me a little bit, but we did not have localized computer networks at the time. And we had a CAMA system, a computer assisted mass appraisal system, that was wired from Laramie to Cheyenne, and extremely slow. And it got to the point where, you would do the data entry on a screen. It'd take you 10 seconds. You'd hit enter, and it would take sometimes like a minute before that data would go to the main server in Cheyenne and then come back to Laramie. And so it's like you can get up, go get a cup of coffee. Oh, my screen just refreshed. So I learned patience. You learn different things, but it's like you can do your work in 10 seconds and then you wait for a minute. But that eventually got resolved. did a lot of data entry, and then, verifying, checking, listening to appeals, going out, verifying information, presented in appeals, getting ready for County Board of Equalization hearings, just whatever needed to be done.
What a broad range of experiences you had over that opportunity. And like you said, in such a rather sparsely populated area.
Yeah. I mean, there were days when we would never see another person the whole day. I mean, we would drive all day, spend all day out. And there was a couple times where you're in a pretty remote area of Wyoming. And there was one place I remember specifically where we had to cross the Laramie River. I can't remember which river it was for sure, but we had to cross it. And we went there in the early summer and the water was too high. There was just no way we were going to get across it. And it was probably, I bet it was 25 yards across the river. Ooh. And there was a ford there where you could see where vehicles had come down and driven across. And so we waited till later in the summer to do that. And we had a full-size Chevy Blazer, 80s model, if you remember those. And pretty big vehicle.
That's a big vehicle.
What I laughed about was that if you get to the ford and you come in on the up, on the side where it's you pull in and it's moving downstream, the drift of the vehicle as you cross the river where you come out is downstream.
Oh, yeah.
And then when we came back, you came into the river where you came out of the river. Oh. And then you drifted again. And so the entrance, so it's like a triangle, that you go in here, you get out here, you go in there, you come out downstream again. And so we were drifting, even though we had it in four-wheel drive and a big full-size vehicle, you hit the water and all four wheels, you start to move with the current. And, obviously people had done this many times because you're moving with the current until you hit that takeout spot. So we got all the way back in there and it was this abandoned ranch that must have been huge at the time. I mean, there were old bunkhouses. There was like 16 individual unit bunkhouses. So they must have had a lot of hired help back in there. And just interesting to see that it's still standing and it's been, not used for many, many years. But those kind of fun experiences, just kind of looking back, the same summer, we very close to getting caught in a flash flood in a different part of the county, coming home and terrible hail and rainstorm, and decided to go ahead and try and push through. And we did, and we made it home safe. But the next day we went through, and the area we came through, there was debris hanging in the trees, like higher than our vehicle was tall. And so shortly after we came through there, it flooded, and it would have been probably a disaster if we would have gotten, been a few minutes later than we were. But
goodness,
kind of gave us a second to reflect about our choices as we got over with it. But I mean, all kinds of great experiences just being out in the rural West and doing valuation work.
Talk about, as they say, seeing America. I mean, you experienced all kinds of things.
Yeah, definitely. That experience was really good. And then, after I'd been there and into college, my wife had gotten a job as a registered nurse at Poudre Valley Hospital in Fort Collins, Colorado. And we had decided to go there, and we moved to Fort Collins. And my bachelor's degree is in wildlife management. It's not anything related to appraisal.
Yeah.
So I was actually looking at going to graduate school at Colorado State in wildlife biology. And, again, one of those fluke things, we went in to license our car at the courthouse at Fort Collins. And I happened to look at the job board, and guess what? There's a job announcement for an appraiser in the assessor's office. I was like, I know how to do that. Hadn't really gotten through the whole application process for graduate school at that time and didn't think too much about it. And so I thought, well, I'm going to apply for that and see if I get it. This was in mid 1990. And so licensing had just come into existence. Ended up interviewing and got a job at the assessor's office as a residential appraiser in the assessor's office in Fort Collins. And luckily at that time, the assessor was adamant that we all get our licenses. And so everybody on his staff, we worked as hard as we could, as fast as we could, and we all got our certified general licenses at that time. The rules were much different then. I think the exams were much different then than where they are now. But I'm so glad that he had the forethought to encourage us all to get licensed at the highest level we could. And, he was very supportive of that. And the state of Colorado was too, the Department of Revenue. So we did that. And that's where I first got my license. I think in 94, I got my certified general license. So I've been doing this for a bit.
That's fantastic.
30 years this coming year. But that was another one where I just kind of stumbled into it. Ended up being a great job, worked there for for quite a few years, about 5 years. And then the good thing about that was my area, for those that are familiar with Larimer County, Colorado, Estes Park, where Rocky Mountain National Park abuts the town of Estes Park, which is part of Larimer County. And then you've got Fort Collins and Loveland. But one of my areas that I worked in that was my responsibility was Estes Park. And so I spent a lot of time up in the mountains doing properties, resort type properties, recreational properties in the mountains adjacent to Rocky Mountain National Park. And
Oh, wow.
ended up actually doing some work on some private inholdings that were in Rocky Mountain National Park. And that was kind of my first exposure to the land tenure patterns in the parks, and kind of looking at, how does that happen? How does somebody get to have a private piece of land and a cabin inside a national park?
That's amazing.
And so that always kind of filed that back in my memory banks. Years later, it became important. But yeah, so I spent a lot of time doing that. And then I had everything east of I-25 to the Weld County line outside of Fort Collins, basically between Loveland and Wellington. So I had a huge territory to cover. And, that was when Fort Collins was booming one of the first times. Saw a big influx of population in the early 90s, and things were just going nuts. So spent all my time measuring houses, drawing houses, data entry, same type of stuff, but just at a much larger scale.
What a fascinating experience. So this significant other have this opportunity, you wander in, you're like, hey, I can do that. And sounds like you, just because we know that you're not there any longer, how did that transition into your next opportunity?
Well, that's a good story in itself. We were there for about 5 years. We were both kind of looking for something else, looking for the next opportunity. And my wife's parents owned a truck stop in rural Wyoming. We basically sold our house, packed up, and moved to Orange Junction, Wyoming, which is about 12 miles south of Douglas, and managed a truck stop that they owned. Did that for 2 years. We didn't, going back to my work at Godfather's Pizza, that was the extent of my food service experience. And we ran a truck stop that had a restaurant, convenience store, RV park, and then all of our fuel sales. And so neither one of us had any food service experience whatsoever, or retail experience for that matter, other than, part-time jobs while we were younger. And we did that for a couple of years, got the business up and running pretty well, and doubled our sales in the 2-year period we were there. And actually really enjoyed running the restaurant. That part I enjoyed. I did a lot of the cooking. But we were 12 miles from town, so we didn't always have a wealth of employees looking to drive 12 miles to work, at a truck stop. And so we ended up spending a lot of time there. It worked out that my wife would a lot of times work the day shift and I would work the night shift, and trying to make sure that we had supervision over the whole time. But we also knew pretty quickly that was not where we wanted to spend the rest of our lives. And so fast forward, my wife got a job with the state of Wyoming as a nursing home inspector, and we moved to Laramie. And I was going to go back to school. Finally, I'd put graduate school on hold for quite a few years.
Got it.
And got back to Laramie, and ended up getting a master's degree in public administration with a graduate minor in environment and natural resources, which again isn't appraisal related. But at that point, I was kind of sort of done being an appraiser. I actually had kind of decided that I wasn't going to pursue appraisal as a profession. I'd going to do something else, whether it was going to be a city manager or work in some sort of other public administration related field. We ended up, my mom again called me, and she said, hey, I've got this, actually it was her business partner. He called me and he said, I've got this assignment that we need you to help out with, or we'd like you to help out with. And I know that your license has lapsed, and I would be willing to pay all your back fees and get that reinstated if you'd come over and help me with this project. And so, I was like, okay, it's summertime. I'm a graduate student. I need some money, and I can do this. And so I said, yeah, that sounds great. And so I went over and we did a review of a whole county in western Nebraska, southwestern Nebraska, where we did a lot of physical inspections and assignment of effective ages and things like that to make the appraisal models work better. And that took all summer. But interesting story, the person who had hired me at the assessor's office in Laramie had retired, and I needed somebody to help me. And so I called him and I said, hey, I got this project. Would you be interested in coming to work for me? And so, a few years later, things change, and he came and actually worked with me for that project for the summer. We did a lot of work in a short period of time. Got to see a tornado up close. Very, very cool experience. And
wow, that's something that most people hopefully never experience.
yeah, I mean, in Nebraska in the summertime, yeah, that's not an unusual occurrence. It was definitely an experience, and we got it knocked out and got it done. But it's funny, you talk about I always like to say, like, circles within circles. You never know, how those relationships that you established many, many years ago will come back and benefit you or both parties down the road. And so, that was one that we cranked it out, went back. I kept my appraisal license. And even though I went into the wildlife management arena while I was in graduate school and shortly after.
Oh, really?
I worked for the Wyoming Game and Fish Department in their forensic lab. We did a lot of wildlife forensic studies and did tooth aging, fish health, a lot of the scientific wildlife work that has to be done. We were one of the first, outside of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service lab in Oregon, we were one of the first that had our own DNA sequencer. And so that lab was kind of on the forefront of DNA analysis related to wildlife. And we did both forensic for criminal investigations and also analysis of different herd structures and genomes to make sure that there wasn't inbreeding going on, or, kind of measuring the level of inbreeding in different wildlife herds or populations, and to try and help improve wildlife management using DNA analysis. So that was one of the first labs that did that exercise.
What an amazing experience to be involved in that level of research and know that the work that you're doing has an impact.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you could see it firsthand where sometimes, that would be the link that they needed to prosecute a poaching case or something like that, would be that DNA link. Actually got my picture in American Hunter magazine, on a case we were working on that was pretty cool at the time. And I always liked wildlife management. I still do. And also developed a love for bird watching at the time. I had an ornithology professor that was outstanding and kind of set the hook. And so that's something I still do on a regular basis. Every time I'm traveling or out and about, I'm always bird watching. I always got a pair of binoculars stashed somewhere. And that's kind of one of my passions these days is bird watching, that developed as part of that career.
That is a wonderful experience. Plus, if you have, as you talked about, you'd go days back to an earlier employment without seeing another person. Much more common with seeing some form of wildlife.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
than anything else.
Once I finished graduate school, I wasn't sure what I was going to do exactly. Mm-hmm. And I got an offer to work at a wildlife consulting firm that was doing all the wildlife monitoring at some wind power installations in Wyoming. And so I spent about 6 months working for them as a wildlife field technician, and, again, spending all day, every day outside. That was a big thing. And it was, we literally would pack up the four-wheelers before the sun came up and Laramie drive to the site and get on our ATVs and drive to our specific points where we were doing monitoring. And love that job. It was a great job. And like you said, you'd see some amazing things. Nothing more so amazing than the weather. We were on a rim, as you can imagine, and we could see about 200 miles west of us. We were in the highest point looking west, and you'd see the weather develop early in the morning, and then you'd be able to tell after a while, like, okay, those clouds are in that specific spot. I think about 2:30, we're going to get wet. And, kind of watch that weather develop and move towards you all day, and kind of just be aware of, what's going on and connected with everything that's happening. Those were great experiences. Had a great crew that I worked with. And, that was at the early times of wind power development. That was one of the first wind plants that was developed in Wyoming, and learned a lot about the renewables, and learned a lot about how important the grid is, rights of way are, property rights, those sorts of things to development of renewables. And so had a great time in that job as well. But again, knew it wasn't going to be the permanent one.
Sure.
And finally got hired as the county appraiser in another assessor's office back in western Nebraska. I was responsible for all of the evaluation work in a whole county. So I did all the commercial, residential, agricultural, commodities, those sorts of things. And that was the first real, I suppose, say real job out of graduate school. It wasn't, part-time contract work. I was a state employee, which was unique because the state of Nebraska at the time had allowed the counties to vote to turn the appraisal assessment function back over to the state. And the county that I worked in, Keith County, Ogallala, Nebraska, was one of the counties that had agreed to send that work back to the state. So I was a state employee. Now I'd moved up from a county employee to a state employee.
Okay.
And working at that at Keith County, but my boss and almost everybody else I worked with was in Lincoln, which was a 4-hour at least drive across the state. So that was my first touch of like remote work from where my supervisor was, which again came in handy later on.
Holy cow! What year was this, Tim? Goodness.
Let's see, that would have been in 1999.
Wow. That predates a portion of the people in the profession, not to mention those still coming in. You don't even remember what that was all about. Goodness.
I had a flip phone. I had a bag phone for my car, You
had a bag phone?
If you remember the magnetic antenna on the...
Oh my, describe the bag phone. I mean, we've had people take the time to appreciate and describe what the rotary dial phone was, but not everybody knew what the bag phone was.
Yeah, it was about half the size of a briefcase, and that was your cell phone. And plugged into the cigarette lighter, and you had an external antenna that went on the roof of the car, and they worked. They did work.
It worked? How heavy was that thing? I'm trying to remember. It's been a long time.
Oh my gosh, they were probably 3 or 4 pounds, I suppose.
Yeah, it wasn't that heavy, but it wasn't light like
it
your
wasn't
mobile
going
phone
in your pocket.
No chance at all. It went in the passenger seat in many cases.
Right. It sat on the passenger seat. Exactly right. Exactly right. But yeah, so I did that for a year. The interesting parts of that was this was a new experience in building up an appraisal organization within the state that had multiple jurisdictions. And again, one of those things at a time you don't think about being valuable, but as I moved into my federal career, that experience of standing up a new organization and trying to bring different leaders together to create an effective and a functional organization, given all the personalities. And that turned out to be a very valuable experience as well down the road, especially within Interior as we sort of restructured our organization. But yeah, that was my first exposure to personality tests, the Myers-Briggs, 360 reviews of your staff and your peers and your supervisors, and having a kind of a 360 evaluation of yourself done. So those were some concepts that have paid off over the years, but learned early on. And again, unfortunately, I knew that was not where I wanted to be. So I kept applying for federal jobs, and I got on with the Bureau of Land Management in Lakewood, Colorado, as a review appraiser.
Wow.
We moved to Denver in 2000, and I've been with the federal government ever since then.
Holy smokes. You had mentioned that was something you were interested in. At that time, to give people some perspective, maybe that don't have as much history to draw upon. What was that process when you said, hey, I was interested, but I was just kind of looking and waiting?
I would say if anybody's out there and they're interested in a federal job or looking at the federal government as an employer, just because you get rejected doesn't mean you're not necessarily qualified for the job. Sometimes it's technicality. Sometimes person screening your application is definitely not an appraiser. And, they may be looking for things that are specific that they've been told to look for that aren't on your resume.
Yes.
The other thing is and this is kind of a nuance of the federal hiring process as well. If you look on USA Jobs, one of the first things I always tell people to look at is, who is this open to? There's a section on USA Jobs that says, who is this open to? And sometimes it's only employees of that particular department, or it's only open to federal employees. It's not open to the public. And so that's the key thing. And there were several that I wasn't aware until later that I figured it out. But there were some jobs I applied for that I, got rejected immediately. And come to find out, it was because it was only open to federal employees or only open to employees of an agency. So there's a lot of those little things that you have to read very carefully on a federal job application. So I just kept after it, was persistent about it, ended up getting an interview and selected for that job. And here's another one of those funny stories, like the shine shoes that got me the job in the assessor's office.
Yes.
I found out after the fact that the person who I ended up working for was actually a University of Wyoming alum. And that was a key thing in his decision to hire me, was that I had gone to the same college. So, again, those little things that you find out after the fact, it's like, wow, okay, well, I guess it was meant to be because it all worked out.
Isn't it wild how things that you have no control over have influence over you?
Right. Yeah. The key thing on those is just be persistent and be diligent about reading the announcement, and then also make sure that your resume and your application package are tailored to the job announcement. So sending a blanket resume into a federal job is probably never going to get you even an interview. You have to be very sure that you go through there and tie everything back to the specifics in the job announcement.
Wow. And, fortunately, what I think I hear you share is that having started out at the county and then going to the state and then to federal, you had worked in these environments that other people have no exposure and experience to. So you kind of had a sense of how things go as opposed to others that might have been quite challenged.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I had worked in or around government long enough to kind of have an understanding of how some of those things work. But definitely the jump between the different levels of government is a big deal. I was honestly surprised a little bit because in some ways the bureaucracy at the state government level was worse than at the federal government level. Yeah, it's hard to believe, but it may have been a factor of the bureau that I worked for was a pretty flat organization at the time, so there wasn't a huge amount of bureaucracy. But at the state level, definitely there was a high level of bureaucracy. I can only say that for the state of Nebraska where I work. That may not be true in other states. But yeah, it's been interesting. I think that gave me a really well-rounded experience in working for different levels of government, because you see that, from almost the very local level, city, county level, then up to the federal government level, and how the focus kind of continues to broaden the higher up you get in the area of control, or expansive control grows greatly from, where we were looking at one defined county all the way up to now we're looking at all of the federal lands in the entire United States, all the territories, including, the South Pacific and the Caribbean and the contiguous 48, Alaska, Hawaii. Those are all under purview of my current office.
Holy smokes. And that is definitely the subject of a round 2 that we're going to be having here, because there are so many fascinating stories, and we recognize in the spirit of timeliness, we want to have an opportunity first for Tim to be able to share a bit about kind of just his pathway in and through the profession. And then in round 2, we're going to have an opportunity to hear some fascinating stories about valuation of things you've probably never even thought of that they have to deal with on a regular basis. So, Tim, you mentioned about being involved in the government and having that broad range of responsibility. I think one perspective that you have that most, but not all, professionals don't even begin to understand are that there are multiple groups within the government that have responsibility for valuation. And you've had the opportunity to be involved, not in all of them, but in some of them, but you could share a little perspective about those groups to kind of help, like, hey, here's kind of what this group handles and what like the group I'm associated with now handles versus the group I used to be associated with handles. Could you take maybe a couple minutes and just share that for everybody's benefit?
Sure, yeah. And, one of those things related to that is how law, regulation, and policy work at the federal level. And so your first question, there's just over 20 federal agencies that employ appraisers. I've worked for 2 big ones, the Department of the Interior and Department of Agriculture, the Forest Service. I spent about 6 years at the Forest Service. They do the bulk of the land management. Forest Service is different because the appraisers are Forest Service employees and the realty side is Forest Service employees. And so it's pretty contained. Here at Interior, we support 5 different bureaus within the Department of Interior. So all of the appraisal work that we do is in support of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, and the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. And so those are our 5 primary clients. We also do work for some other offices, the Office of Native Hawaiian Relations. At times, we've done work for USGS. We do some valuation work related to our minerals evaluation shop for the Internal Revenue Service. We've done work for FAA. Different organizations at times have a need, but they don't have appraisers on staff. So each one kind of has their own purview, and ours is one of the biggest footprints of any of the federal agencies. Each one has a little bit unique because it goes back to their implementing regulations or laws and how they conduct their business. And so each one of our clients has its own law, organic act, sometimes they call it, where they were created, like the Park Service and Fish and Wildlife Service back early 1900s. BLM, their organic act is the Federal Land Policy Management Act, which was passed in 1976. So they're one of the more recent as far as their organic act. But each one of those outlines the way they do business. And essentially our appraisal function follows that way of doing business as authorized by law. And so we have to be very conscious of what the law requires and how that can impact appraisals. Each agency that has appraisers on staff has to go through that exercise to make sure that the appraisals they do comport with the law, regulation, and policy that governs how land transactions take place for that particular agency.
That's phenomenal and way beyond the scope of most people's work, that there's not just one way of doing things, but as you touched on, these agencies, even within various agencies, may have slightly different legal guidance on how to proceed with valuation.
Absolutely. And it's even more profound. We work in appraisals in Indian country. Each reservation sometimes has its own Organic Act rule. So from reservation to reservation under BIA oversight can even vary how we have to do appraisals or how we handle certain things. So it can get very nuanced, but that's one of the things that we counsel our staff all the time is to make sure what legal authority is this transaction being done under, and does it have any specific appraisal guidance that you need to be aware of to make sure that you're complying with the competency rule and the scope of work rule and USPAP and, are doing the job in the way that is defensible and credible and all of those sorts of things that we're all familiar with.
Well, Tim, I appreciate you taking just a brief moment to comment on that and share a little perspective that far exceeds most people's understanding, and yet at the same time ties back into the unique factors and characteristics of each of the agencies that all have their own domain of knowledge and realm of responsibility.
Yeah, and if you think about it, they each have their own mission and objectives. And, like the Park Service and Fish and Wildlife Service are generally, the Park Service is preserving those parks in perpetuity for future generations. And that's sort of their goal. And if you look at BLM, for an example, the Bureau of Land Management, they're governed by multiple use sustained yield principles where they're not favoring one use over another. And if you think back to, the settling of the West and the Louisiana Purchase, all those resources that are out there on public lands were acquired to help the country develop. And so BLM has a very different role and mission in facilitating the use of those public lands versus preserving those, like the Park Service, preserving, those natural wonders for future generations. And so the way we approach those is very different. And the way those agencies approach their work is very different. And we have to just be adaptable to meet whatever requirements are necessary. So, one thing like for BLM, we may be looking at, a permit for installing an oil and gas compressor station along a pipeline on BLM lands versus at a Park Service is usually to acquire land to expand the park or provide access or those sorts of things. So it's very different. Each agency kind of has its own personality, has its own ways of doing business and its own mission.
That's phenomenal because probably I would say it's a high probability prior to this very unique podcast session that when people would mention Parks and Recreation, they're probably thinking of the famous show known as Parks and Rec with Amy Poehler. They're not thinking of Bureau of Land Management and governmental agencies. And yet here in the flesh, Tim Hansen is telling us all about a whole different perspective of Parks and Rec.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a challenge. And that's one of the things when I talk to our employees about why they love working here is every day is a challenge. Everything is new. You don't know what's coming in the door from day to day. It's not, doing 10 houses in a residential subdivision and then next day doing 10 more houses in a residential subdivision. It can vary widely, from day to day what we're tasked with. And sometimes there are novel things that we've not seen or that I'm not aware of in appraisal practice. I mean, sometimes we get asked to do things that are way out there.
Yeah, no, you have some phenomenal stories that we'll be touching on here in just a bit in our next section. What, given the experience you've had with the federal government, being involved in one of the agencies, and most recently your role, you want to just share a little bit about what your current role is? You touched on it, but just now that we've distinguished that there are over 20 different agencies and they, to a certain degree, work together. In a lot of cases, they work on their own.
Yeah. So my current position, I'm the director of the Appraisal and Valuation Services Office within the Department of the Interior. So we have 5 bureaus, which I mentioned before, that we provide all the valuation work for. But one of the unique things about my position is I think I'm the only appraisal member of the Senior Executive Service within the federal government. So the Senior Executive Service is a very small cohort of senior executives that are tasked with, implementing each administration's goals and guidances, or goals and missions and objectives when they change hands. And so there's a small pool. It's like, I think it's like 8,000 SES members out of 2 million federal employees. So it's a very small percentage. There aren't a whole lot of us, but we have a different role to play. And so sometimes, as administrations change, the perspective change, the focuses change, and then we're tasked with implementing those from a career perspective, not a political perspective. And so that sometimes is a challenge, but it's one of those things that we're in place to do. But right now we have about 170 staff members. I think 115 of those are appraisers, and we're scattered we have an office in Anchorage, we have one in Atlanta, and we have multiple offices in between: Sacramento, Phoenix, Las Vegas, Albuquerque, Denver, Minneapolis, and Ashland, Wisconsin. We have our kind of our headquarters in Washington, D.C. So big organization, tons of responsibility, tons of workload.
That's amazing. I know before I met you a number of years ago, and even a couple of your peers at different like Department of State and some other groups, I just never even thought about all the potential users of appraisal services. And as you shared over the years and more recently about just the broad range of assignments you all work on, it's absolutely fascinating. And it was eye-opening to be like, hey, maybe you are someone who loves wildlife and would love to be, dealing more in biology and would love to be every day out, all day outdoors. It's like, wow, there's actually a role for you. Maybe it isn't pulling out your slide rule and pulling out your mechanical pencil and drawing exterior properties on graph paper for a mass appraisal system, or even just for, in this case, just a residential loan application. I mean, it's absolutely intriguing to see the wide range of assignments. Given the role that you're in and the responsibility that you have over the next 3 to 5 years, like what is most intriguing or inspiring or even really feeding your optimistic outlook?
I mean, one of the exciting things I think right now that we're working on is we've had an apprentice program over the years, and it's kind of ebbed and flowed, but we're really looking at standing that back up in a big way to try and increase the number of appraisers, and with an additional focus on diversity. We've made a conscious effort to try and recruit apprentices that are from underrepresented groups, demographics in the profession. And that's something that I'm really excited about. We've got a good core group of people working on it to try and stand up what I like to call maybe our appraisal school. Eventually we would develop to where we would take in a certain number of apprentices every year, work them through a system, and then hopefully with the goal of getting certified general appraisers cranked out in 3 to 4 years, whether they end up working for us or working for other agencies or working in the private sector. For me, it's a big focus on trying to improve the viability of the profession going forward. You see all of us are getting older. You look at some of the numbers and it seems a little bit depressing. And I think, we've missed an opportunity in a way as a profession. I've heard it many times before. I don't want to train my competition. I don't want to take on an apprentice. And, now that's really coming back to bite us in a big way. I mean, there's just like a whole missing few cohorts of trainees or journey level apprentice or appraisers that are out there that, we missed out on. And now it's trying to expand that, kind of build that back up. Maybe too late in the game, but I'm going to do what I can to try and help increase the number of appraisers, certified general appraisers. And I think we have a good tool in place to do that. Our program was recognized by the Department of Labor as a registered apprenticeship program. And so that's also opened some doors to us for recruiting and maybe some financial assistance down the road for apprentices that might be interested. But it's still evolving. We're hoping to roll that out more formally probably mid-2024. But we do have 2 apprentices that we're looking at bringing on board before the end of the calendar year, and with the hopes to bring a lot more on in the coming years. But that's one of the things that keeps me excited. I'm getting to the end of my career, and so I'm starting to try and plan for.
Oh, Tim, you're so young at heart. I couldn't imagine that.
I'm not saying I'm going to retire completely, but it may be time for that next chapter. So I'm I'm looking at ways that I can be helpful to the profession, and I may end up staying here for longer. I don't know. At that point where I'm looking at different options and trying to do what's meaningful for me. And I think there's a lot of things I can do here that are meaningful, but there may be other opportunities out there as well. So I'm excited that it's been a great career, and, moving forward, I think it will continue to be a great career. It just may look different than it does today, but that's not a bad thing.
I think that's fantastic. Tim, I just want to say thank you for sharing some perspective on an area of the profession that has little visibility, mainly because although probably covers by far the largest landmass of any particular role, it also has a very low number of staff appraisers. And something we'll touch on in a bit is there's a lot of calling upon professionals for unique assignments or geographically specific assignments. That is a way that some people get exposure to it. But I just really appreciate the opportunity to gain an understanding of how much is available once you have a tool set called an appraisal framework. And there's so many different ways to apply that. So again, I just want to say thanks here for what we determined would be episode 1 of 2. And everyone, thanks for spending a little time with us at this point to listen in and gain some perspective from Tim on county and state and federal involvement in the appraisal process and how it's utilized. And we look forward to you joining us for the next episode. And until then, be sure to continue to share the podcast. It is wonderful to hear the feedback and the insights that people have gained and some of the actions people are taking as a direct result of the professional journeys that their peers have been on. Until then, have a fantastic fall season. We'll talk to you here real soon.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Zing's Appraisers on Purpose. We hope you enjoyed learning from the amazing life paths and achievements of our guests. Don't forget to like us on LinkedIn and other podcast channels to hear more from appraisers and valuers regarding their life and their work. If you have any suggestions or questions for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. Just send us a message on LinkedIn and we'll be sure to get back to you. Thanks again for listening, and until we're together again for the next session of Zing's Appraisers on Purpose, create the change that you seek.